Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Franklin. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go to get more information on the show, to listen to past episodes, and to connect with us on social media if that's something you'd like to do. I think a lot about history on this show, and this is something that happens to tie in with my own family history, and maybe yours too, because this impacted a lot of people, and even more people who are descended from those people. Because as you know, like, there was a period of our history where a whole bunch of folks were coming from Eastern and Central Europe. And that was the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And there were millions of Jewish immigrants especially who emigrated from those areas by ship and came to the United States. Among them, my great-grandfather and his family, who came from Odessa in Ukraine. And the structures that were in place to make this possible didn't come about by happenstance. They were the result of a group of men who, through a series of powerful alliances and rivalries, created a system that changed the face of America and really changed the face of the world, ultimately. And our guest today has written a book about them. Steven Ujifusa is the author of The Last Ships from Hamburg, Business, Rivalry, and the Race to Save Russia's Jews on the Eve of World War I. Steven, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. So, I think that most people would probably, in the United States of America today, have a pretty good sense of why Jewish people in Europe would have wanted to leave Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Bring us up to speed, set the scene, if you will, to explain to folks who aren't immersed in the history why in the late 1800s and early 1900s people in Central and Eastern Europe, especially Jewish folks, would want to leave. What was going on at that time?
Well, Beowulf, just like you, I am descended from these Russian Jewish immigrants. My great-grandparents on my mom's side came over in the 1890s. And this story starts off in the Russian Empire in 1881, where Tsar Alexander II is assassinated by an anarchist group called the People's Will. And Tsar Alexander II was a relatively liberal czar who was moving the country towards constitutional monarchy. And when his father was assassinated, his successor, Alexander III, said, we need to crack down on radicalism. We need to crack back on democracy. And he found a target among Russia's 4 million Jews who had already been living in pretty much restricted circumstances for hundreds of years. But they became seen as a easy scapegoat for the problems of the Russian Empire, which is suffering from rapid industrialization, gross income inequality. And he said, you know what, this is the perfect time to have, as a safety valve for the anger of the Russian people, take it out on the Jews. And Russia, unlike every other European country, which was moving towards liberalization, giving Jews full citizen rights, such as in Germany and France and in Great Britain. Russia said, we are not going to give Jews full citizen rights. In fact, anti-Semitism is state policy. That meant that the Russian cavalry Cossacks could go and rape, pillage, and burn Jewish villages. Russian citizens are more than welcome to take part in pogroms, and the police will stand by and watch. And the third really scary thing was that Russia's military began conscripting young boys, specifically Jewish boys, to serve in the army at the age of 10. Mm. If they survived, they would come back in 20, 25 years, not Jewish and not knowing their family or their culture. This is something that the Russian Empire, the Russian Tsar, did to many minorities in the Russian Empire, but especially Jews.
Yeah. It's frightening, and I really need to find out more about my own history. I know the sort of basic outline of where they came from, where they eventually settled, which was in Savannah, Georgia. But I don't think I even know the name of the ship that they came on. I know my great grandfather was 10 years old when he came to the United States, but I know that. His dad worked as sort of an administrator on an estate outside of Odessa in what is now Ukraine. But I don't know a lot more of the details about specifically like what caused them to emigrate. But I'm sure it may well have been tied in with a lot of the forces that you're describing. I know that I think my great grandfather was he was only about 10 years old when he first came to the United States, and that was in about 1890. So he could have been subject to those same conscription laws that you're talking about. But it makes me want to know more. So when those forces were applied, those the ruthless and anti-Semitic forces, there came into place. There was built up a system in terms of transportation and finance that allowed them and many others to leave Europe and seek greener pastures in the United States. And much of the book, as you outline, focuses on the stories of Jacob Schiff, Albert Ballin, and J.P. Morgan. What were each of their roles? Who were they individually? And how did they begin to build the system of transport and finance that allowed this mass migration to take place?
Well, it's funny, by the way. I've often been asked, why is J.P. Morgan is kind of the uber goy?
No doubt.
But let's start with Albert Ballin. Albert Ballin was born in 1857 to a downwardly mobile Jewish family in the city of Hamburg. And after he lost his father at the age of 17, he had to fend for himself. And his father ran a immigrant ticket agency in Hamburg. And Hamburg was a pretty large port of departure for immigrants. And it was for him, he saw this as a huge opportunity for business. And he eventually partnered up with a shipping company called the Car Line, and it became a company that sent immigrants by ship to Liverpool and then to the United States.
Okay.
And this became a thorn in the side of the biggest shipping company in Hamburg, the Hamburg America Line. Okay. And Hamburg America Line hired him to become their chief of the passenger division. And by 1889, at a very young age, he had become managing director of the Hamburg America Line, which was an incredible rise for a poor Jewish kid in a very, Jews had equal rights in the unified imperial Germany, but there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. And he was the one that basically came up with this system of getting Jews mostly as out of the Russian Empire. And he and his company's competitor, the North German Lord, set up a series of border checkpoints that were controlled by the company that allowed Jewish refugees to cross. It was essentially illegal border crossing because there was no port on the Russian coast that connected it with New York City. So they were put up, these immigrants were put on sealed trains for Germany. They were deposited in Hamburg, where they were put aside in an immigrant village that housed thousands of immigrants at a time. There was kosher food. They were checked for diseases. It prevented them from being. It basically was a way of making sure they didn't get rejected at Ellis Island, then put on these ships. And
so there was sort of a pre-Ellis Island to set up on the European side of things.
Yes, Albert Ballin masterminded that. It was a business decision because if immigrants were rejected at Ellis Island, then they'd be sent back at steamship expense. The second character, Jacob Schiff, was the leading investment banker in America of Jewish descent. He was from Frankfurt, Germany, came over in the 1860s as a young man. His father sent him over with $500 and a package of kosher meat for the crossing. And Jacob Schiff became investment banker to the Rockefellers, to the Pennsylvania Railroad. His firm, Kuhn Loeb and Company, was second only to J.P. Morgan as a investment bank. And Jacob Schiff used his vast wealth for philanthropy, mostly for Jewish philanthropy. He set up a whole network of charities, settlement houses to make Jews feel welcome in the United States. He felt that America was the new promised land for the Jewish people, and he felt the Tsar was the great spawn. It was the spawn of Satan for the Jewish people. He helped finance the Japanese and the Russo-Japanese War to stick it to the Russians. Wow. And he also helped finance the Hamburg America Line. He was very close with Albert Ballin and the Warburg family of Hamburg,
Right.
who he was, the Warburgs and the Schiffs were intermarried. And then the third person was J.P. Morgan, who tried to do what he did for railroads to the steamship lines. And this is a man who had a vast ego, vast wealth, and had never failed at anything. So what he tried to do was buy up every single steamship line he could. And the immigrant trade was the most lucrative part of the shipping business in the world. And he bought up the White Star Line. He tried to buy Cunard. He tried to buy the German shipping companies. But Albert Ballin was probably the only person one of the few people who was able to foil J.P. Morgan. He stopped the deal from going through. And J.P. Morgan, who was very anti-Semitic, never hired Jews, he offered Albert Ballin $1 million a year in the early 1900s to be head of his new trust, the International Mercantile Marine. And Albert Ballin said, absolutely not. I'm loyal to my company. I'm loyal to Germany. Have fun with that. He knew that J.P. Morgan's company would fail without the immigrant trade.
Interesting. So really, it was kind of the competition between the two of them. They were each, and it's it seems like a figment of the past, because we have so many companies which do so thorough a job of doing ultimately what J.P. Morgan wanted to do, and merging and shutting out competition. In this case, there was real competition for something that, although it was motivated by kind of desperate socioeconomic conditions, was a very profitable enterprise. And so because of how the two of them interacted, they were competing for tickets to sell them to people who desperately wanted to make a new life in this country. And that was sort of the engine, economically speaking, for the pipeline to the United States of America at that time, if you will.
Yes. Well, I think of it this way. It was a ticket on a ocean liner in the early 1900s was maybe the equivalent of $1,100 a person, which is a lot of money for a poor Jewish family living in a shtetl in the empire, plus railroad tickets. So
was that in the dollars of the time, or is that in inflation?
Oh, that's in current day dollars. Back then, it was maybe around $30.
Okay, right.
But it was extremely expensive. Imagine saying goodbye to everyone you knew.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage to do that.
Yeah.
And you're leaving people behind. It was kind of like a funeral in a way when you were leaving your family.
Yeah.
You have to sell everything you owned, and then you'd have to cross the border. And if the family was very poor, the father would go ahead first and then earn some money working as a milliner on the Lower East Side, working in the factory, and then send the money back, and then mom and the kids would follow. But it was a terrifying journey. And I just can't imagine as a parent putting myself in that situation. Then you're going to sea on these big ocean liners, which by the early 1900s were these enormous technological marvels. Albert Ballin was a brilliant visionary when it came to the size and speed and luxury of his ships. But in steerage, the business models of these ships where you'd have maybe 800 in first class, 500 in second, then 2,000 in steerage and open dormitories.
Yeah.
It was terrifying for these immigrants.
And then once they reached the United States, often New York City, conditions were often not very good. I'm wondering, were there things that the Jacob Schiff, since he was trying to get Jewish immigrants to come to the United States, as you say, the new promised land, were there things that he did individually as a philanthropist to sort of make that a little better? Because it was a time where there wasn't a whole lot of government assistance, and the idea of that was just kind of starting to blossom in people's minds, and really wouldn't come into fruition for another couple of decades, at least.
This was an age of laissez-faire capitalism. There was no government assistance for anyone who is starving or having problems making ends meet. So Jacob Schiff gave generously to institutions such as the Montefiore Hospital, which was a charity hospital for Jewish people. He gave to the Henry Street Settlement House, which provided education and social support for immigrants. And he lived in a big townhouse on the on the Upper East Side. But whenever he